snacks. Hey, it's Sam, and I'm speaking to you today about two events that happened in history. Parallel events. One is about to happen, and one happened a few hundred years ago, and it's two solar eclipses in the sign of Leo. On September 5th, 1793, there was a solar eclipse that passed through northeastern Europe, across Poland, that area, which coincided with the beginning of the Reign of Terror in France. The Reign of Terror was a period of violence that occurred after the onset of the French Revolution. And it began between September 1793 and July 28, 1794, which also coincided with a solar eclipse, this time in Cancer. In August 2017, we're going to have a solar eclipse in the United States that passes into an eerily similar way to the eclipse in 1793. The solar eclipse path passes through the continental United States a few hundred miles from Washington, D.C., just like the eclipse in 1793 passed very close to France and Paris. And when we compare these two charts, it's pretty remarkable. You know, I always tell my students, I stress the fact that these two moments never happen again. Even though it might look like, well, you have these planets here, then they're there, and, well, they sort of all kind of come around again. You never have the same combination of planets repeating twice. It happens once, and then it's never exactly the same. This isn't exactly the same, but I don't know if I've ever seen two charts that are as similar. First of all, we have the solar eclipse in Leo. Sun, Moon, Rahu, and Mercury retrograde in Leo. Mercury retrograde is the exact same degree, 13 degrees. You have Mars and Venus in Cancer in both charts. Mars and Venus are in Cancer. And then you have Jupiter in Scorpio in the 1793 eclipse. In the August eclipse, we have Saturn in Scorpio. It's pretty remarkable. And the parallels between what was happening in 18th century France and what's happening especially in 21st century America are very similar. I'll read a little bit here. During 1794, the revolutionary France was beset with conspiracy theories by internal and foreign enemies. So after the revolution, internal and foreign enemy conspiracy theories. Within France, the revolution was opposed by the French nobility, which had lost its inherited privileges. The French government established the Committee of Public Safety, which took its final form on September 6, 1793, in order to suppress the internal counter-revolutionary activities and raise additional French military forces. So this Committee of Public Safety took its final form on September 6, 1793, which is right at the establishment of what they call the Reign of Terror, right after the eclipse. So right after the eclipse, as the eclipse was happening, they established the Committee of Public Safety and then started chopping people's heads off who opposed the revolution. Now, the revolution were the people rising up against the aristocracy. In France at the time it was Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette. And again, once the revolution began, they were beset with conspiracies by internal and foreign enemies. The revolution was opposed by the nobility, which had lost its inherited privileges. So let's make a quick parallel to the United States political situation. The revolution, let's say, was the recent election, which was a referendum on the establishment. Clearly, the establishment. So someone gets put in place who is anti-establishment, even though beyond being anti-establishment, they were completely devoid of any major subtle policy nuances. Large swaths of get rid of the bad ones, keep the good ones, stronger military, demagoguing issues like we need to keep out the bad ones and all of that kind of stuff. Other than that, there was very little about preserving the establishment, quote, which the establishment would be the same as the nobility who had lost its privileges once the revolution began. So we could say, once the revolution began, which you might say now it's happened in that sense, or at least it can be interpreted that way as this election, a lot of the establishment lost its inherited privileges. So then what happened is they established the Committee of Public Safety as a hedge against resistance to the revolution. Oh, you're opposed to our revolution? We're going to guillotine 250,000 people. It's very easy to see how this tracks with this political climate in the United States, especially the conspiracies, internal and foreign enemies. It's the same rhetoric. Foreign enemies, there are literally conspiracies about foreign enemies, like Russian hacking, internal, and conspiracies about internal enemies like the media, foreign enemies like Muslims, Mexicans, and conspiracies about them. Carnage in the streets. Every time Mexican immigration is talked about, they talk about the 2 or 3 times the woman was raped in the sanctuary city. Okay, talks nothing about the millions and millions of people who don't bother anybody. Again, the conspiracy theorizing. We're beset with this. Just even the conspiracy that the media is, fake news. Everything the media says it's a conspiracy. Or people believe a conspiracy theory over what their own eyes show them. I know I see this myself. From the beginning, I've been talking about how the now president just lies all the time. Your own eyes can show you that. Your own eyes show you he's lying. He lies about the severity of things. He makes up ideas. He makes up facts. Since he's been in office, he's probably lied 100 times. And it just rolls off people's backs now. Highest crime rate in 47 years. Size of my crowd. This. I believe this. It just never stops. Something that made me shudder the other night, which sounds very much like the Committee of Public Safety, was this new office called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. Boy, he wants to establish the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. People need to pay attention to that. It got boos. But we need to really pay attention. This is very much the victims of immigration crime engagement shows a positioning toward, again, conflating and distorting a problem in order to find a solution to a problem that really doesn't exist in proper measure to the resources and the actions that are about to be taken. Similar to the Committee of Public Safety. The solution to beating back dissent from those who weren't on board for the revolution, meaning those who still wanted to preserve some of the old world, was to chop their heads off. So we've had a revolution where the promise is to, drain the swamp and kick and go against the establishment has produced, by the way, the most establishment swamp-ridden cabinet. Insiders, billionaires, people who have no business occupying the cabinet chairs they head. In fact, they're antagonistic to those agencies. Again, a revolution to destroy the very institutions that are there. And the chief strategist Bannon came out and flat out said it. That he's a deconstructionist, which is to destroy the government. To destroy it. Again, not to say that certain things don't need to be destroyed, but replace it with what? Somebody's got to be in control of all of that power then. Who? You guys? Destroy it so that what? You're calling the shots? That's called a monarchy. So this victims of immigration crime engagement is these kinds of edicts that start to erode dialogue. Similar to saying that because you ask me tough questions and because you point out my lies and because you ask me to be accountable for my words, you're fake news. The reporters aren't creating the news. They're asking questions that everybody wants to ask. Even his own supporters, which has been polled. They want to put that behind them. They don't quite believe it, but they're concerned about it. And now we're going to see how they maneuver the revolution, because this is what they want. This is what the administration wants. They are like the French Revolution, overthrowing the establishment and destroying it. Steve Bannon is a Leninist, as he calls himself. It's just a revolutionary. They just want to destroy the structure. And I don't think the president has any imagination about what would replace it, because he just wants power, which is obvious. He just wants to be the one that everybody's cheering for and looking at. By the time we get to the summer, we better watch out. I'm just going to say this. And I don't like to say this kind of stuff. I don't. And I'm going to say this as well. I saw this back in the summer of 2015 when I first looked at his chart, and I remembered this reign of terror charts. These reign of terror charts. I remember them, and I looked at his chart, and I looked up the eclipse again, and I went, ugh, I really don't want him to be president when we get this eclipse. But we do. I really didn't want him to be president when we got this eclipse. We were going to get this eclipse regardless of who was president. And we have to be very vigilant. We have to be vigilant to the erosion of public discourse. And we're already seeing a lot of protests, and we see somewhat a certain amount of tolerance, but it's not going to stop. The dissent is not going to stop. And in this case, it's the dissent against the revolution The people that are against the current government are like the ones who were getting their heads chopped off in the French Revolution. Those were the ones. Of course, they were advocating what was then the old system, because that was the government they had. That was the paradigm. They were, even if they weren't for that, they were just against the edicts of the revolution. Again, what happens is often a revolution is more authoritarian than what it replaced. The aristocracy was authoritarian. The revolution was more authoritarian. Hello? The establishment was authoritarian. The revolution against the establishment, because it's trying to maintain this intellectual purity, this purity of vision, is often more rigid and authoritarian than what it replaced. This is throughout history. This eclipse that's coming in August portends some very potentially ominous overtones. We need to be very vigilant against the erosion of our right to assemble, the abuse of any kind of National Guard, military, to quell public outcry if this kind of thing starts to happen. We need to be vigilant to false flag operations or any kind of intense backlash against something. Realize, in this current administration, nothing has even happened. Like nothing in the world. Nothing in the world has really even happened that implicates us. What we've been dealing with the current administration is just the madness and the craziness of the person in office for a month and a half. And just, this is what I knew would happen. This is what I knew would happen. Whether he's a good guy or bad guy or this or that, it's just the whole world reacting now to this man's inability to just be composed and relatively sane and actually be measured and mature. To a man who constantly needs attention, who constantly needs to be the one everybody's talking about, and who can't rest and relax without spinning attention to himself. It was exhausting enough through a campaign to have this person now the center of power, where he could actually really, obviously, create all kinds of pain for us, is the reason it's such a threat. And by the way, I said this on the inauguration chart, which I'll post in this article. I said at the time, he's going to try to continue to manipulate through fear, and it's not going to work. And what happened? He spent about a month and a half trying to manipulate through fear. Didn't work. What did he do at the recent speech? This hopeful vision. Yes. Yes. Now, everyone needs to be totally skeptical of this, because he's still, within the same speech, it was the same demagogic vision, like establishing the victim of immigrant crime and, saying radical Islamic terrorism and all of the hard-headed Neanderthal approaches to subtlety that we come to expect. But he's changing the tone, he's changing his tactics, which, again, in many ways, is more dangerous. In some ways, because then it becomes quite normalized. So we are living in parallel times. And, I don't like making these kind of updates about this kind of potentially ominous stuff. But it's also really the reason why I didn't want him to be president, not just because of what I seen, but I saw this was coming, and I see how this tracks with his chart, and it's quite dangerous and scary. And let's see which revolution takes hold. What I would like to see was that the revolution is sweeping this regime out, because I don't think they're qualified. The level of corruption already and the lack of capacity to be up to the task is already stunning. You had a national security advisor resign because they're compromised by another government. We just had the attorney general we see that he lied in his confirmation hearing, that he had meetings with Russians. People need to understand, and again, this is one of the problems with the times we live in. Like, everyone's hair should be on fire over this. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer in the United States. Do you get that? Like, you do not have the chief law officer lie in a confirmation hearing about something like that. And that's all it was. It was a flat-out lie. But the chief law enforcement officer, the Attorney General, the one who is there to protect you and me as Americans from abuses of government, that's what the Attorney General is. The Attorney General is not the President's attorney. There needs to be a firewall between even the President and the Attorney General, because the Attorney General is the appointee for the people. He's to represent us and make sure we're not getting screwed. Not that the President's not getting screwed. He's not there to protect the President from the law. He's there to enforce the law on our behalf. He's there to be the most hawkish son of a bitch against anyone that would infringe on our law. Anything that would even sniff of a foreign government influencing. The Attorney General should be the one who, doesn't matter what the President says, we're going after this relentlessly. Does that sound like Jeff Sessions? These times we're living in are dangerous. They seem unprecedented, but they're not. There is a correlation to this past, and it's pretty intense. And we should be aware of it, we should see it, and go into it with our eyes open.